Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to Masters and Volz, the Business of Politics. The Business of Politics focuses on interviewing guests who are experts or work in the business of politics, that is, electing candidates to office and influencing policymakers. I'm here today with my co-host, Bill Volz. We're both with the university, Wayne State University. Bill, say hello to our audience and introduce yourself.
Bill Volz, Professor of Business Law and Ethics at the Mike Ilitch School of Business at Wayne State, and looking forward to speaking with Professor Grossman today.
I'm Merrick Masters, also with the business school, and I'm a professor emeritus. That means I have library privileges and various other things that go with that honorific title. But our guest today is Professor Matt Grossman. He's with Michigan State University. He is the director of the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research at Michigan State University. He has published numerous books and numerous articles on topics in his areas of expertise, which span political parties, public policy, campaigns and elections, and the science of politics. He has appeared regularly on such programs as 538's online political analysis and published op-ed pieces in the New York Times and the Washington Post. Welcome, Professor. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Well, we have a few questions we'd like to ask you. Let's start with your path, your career path to a political scientist. And I might say, just as an aside, my dad was a political scientist, and his first teaching job was at then Wayne University at Wayne State in Detroit area in the 1950s. So tell us a little bit about what led you to be a political scientist, your role as director of this institute, and what prompted your interest in the areas that you picked, such as political party networks, campaigns and elections, and public opinion.
Well, on the one hand, I've never left college. Went to college, then grad school, and then came directly to Michigan State. So sort of stayed in the ivory tower the whole time. On the other hand, I've always been kind of involved in practical politics as well. From a young age, my family was sort of amateur political consultant types, and I did like 5 internships in college, and then I was involved working for the state of California while I was in graduate school. And then ever since I have been a professor at Michigan State, I've sort of been pretty active in state politics and policy, including involving students in what's happening at the Capitol. So the role that I have now is really a nice institutionalized partner in state government. We have a political leadership candidate training program. We get to see the new legislators when they're first elected. We do regular legislative staff trainings. We have an award program for legislative interns. And we're starting a new program where legislators will go visit one another's districts from very different parts of the state. So we kind of have that institutional role. And then my research has been focused on American national politics, especially political parties and interest groups. I have been privileged to be able to study kind of everything that's at the center of the news. So the kinds of things people think they can ask political scientists about. And some of my colleagues will be like, well, I study conflict in Africa, so I can't tell you. But I am actually able to answer many of those, or at least discuss many of those topics that are at the center of the news.
Well, it sounds like you're in a very strong position to sort of link the practice of politics with the study of politics. And you've done that at many levels. You've not only done that at the federal level, but you've done it intensively at the state level, which I find a very fascinating area that is perhaps not as widely discussed, at least in the news media, as the federal level. But I want to focus my initial question for you is on the recent presidential election of 2024. And there are many pollsters and pundits that have speculated that we might be on the cusp of a realignment of the political parties. What is your thought about that? And how would you put it into a broader historical context, this recent election?
So, and I also, my institute also oversees the Survey Research Center at Michigan State University. So I also have my little pollster hat as well. Yeah, and there's sort of two interesting stories here. On the one hand, we have kind of calcified a partisanship. Our correlations between how an individual votes and how a geographic area votes from one election to the next have never been stronger. That is, we're seeing sort of very little change from one election to the next compared to what we used to see. And we, haven't had either party win a national presidential election by more than 10 points since 1984. So we have been kind of fighting between the 45-yard lines for 40 years now. So that's the sort of calcification story. But on the other hand, the party coalitions have been slowly changing from one election to another in the same direction, such that over a couple decades, you see a big change. And the biggest one is a change in the class dynamics of the party. In terms of income and education, the Democratic Party of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris looks much closer to the Republican Party of Bob Dole than it does to the Democratic Party of Bill Clinton in its income and education level composition. And interestingly, that mirrors trends that are happening all over the rich world. That is, the income divide between the two parties is declining, while the education divide increases, mostly as we start talking more about cultural issues relative to economic issues in our politics. But it's meant that even though when any given election, we're not changing very many people or places, overall, over decades, you get pretty significant change.
Would you say, just to follow up on that very briefly, that the Republican Party is more working class? And would you say, in your judgment, is that a function of Donald Trump, or is it a function of more systemic changes?
Well, it depends how you define class. Of course, if you ask Americans, very few will admit to being in the upper middle class or the upper class. Everybody's working class or middle class, according to themselves. But in terms of education and income, which is also occupational status, as we usually think about it, certainly there's been huge changes in the Republican Party coalition that have mirrored changes in the right worldwide. It is a little bit more specific to education than income, though. So if you take a look at the people who've changed the most, the people who've moved rightward the most are actually the people who are in that off diagonal where they have high income despite low education. And the people who are moving the fastest leftward are the people with the high education but low income. We'll call them graduate students. And so they those people who are kind of not matching the overall correlation between education and income are moving the most. But the big picture is, income matters less and education matters more. The big difference between the US and elsewhere is that we really don't have an outlet for these kind of off diagonal folks. So they have to remake the major American parties. So, for example, in the German election that just happened, there was really no difference between the center left and the center right parties in their education levels. But there were very educated people in the Green Party and very non-college educated people in the far right party. And so in the US, those constituencies appear in the major parties and now are a big part of the divisions between the major party. All of it was happening before Donald Trump, but accelerated by Donald Trump. So it's not that he has no role in the story here. He really is something that's more like something that would be in a far right anti-immigration, anti-system party in other countries. And so he was able to kind of make those coalitional transformations happen faster and perhaps more permanently.
Bill, I'll turn things over to you.
I wanna stick. Maybe it's talking about the Republican Party. Maybe it's talking about the right. But while traditionally we've talked about family, faith, community as kind of the pillars of republicanism, or maybe it's conservatism. But now we hear more about a kind of unrest, maybe anger, or even, rage of some sort. Is that something that you see in any way permeating the Republican coalition that has put together, albeit a thin majority in houses of Congress and elected President Trump?
Certainly, there's more prominent anti-institutional, burn down the institutions, they're against us views in the Republican Party than there used to be. But we wouldn't say that that was a completely new phenomenon on the right. Similarly, on the left, I think the change has actually been a kind of a pro-institutional direction that we saw, especially in COVID. But that continues, and that would be a surprise to people on the left from the 1960s that that it had developed these kind of pro-institutional attitudes. But yeah, I think in the 1990s when we talked about the culture war, we really thought the U.S. would be different, and it would be different because it was more religious and because our politics were more about this kind of lines of religion than it was in Europe or elsewhere. But it's really not turned out to be all that different in the U.S. Than internationally. Now we have a culture war that's also about globalization, about immigration, about trade, that divides the left and the right here and elsewhere. So in some ways there's been continuity, but I think where there's been change, it kind of mirrors those international trends.
I want to talk a bit about polling. And, there's a riff that says, whatever you see the polls look like for President Trump, that they underestimated a support level that was afraid to communicate. And I'm going to follow that up with, just generally speaking about, you talked about running the Survey Research Center at Michigan State. Are there growing, or they've always been there, difficulties in polling accuracy? Are there challenges that polls have today that historically maybe haven't been there?
Well, in terms of overall accuracy, it really isn't declining. That is, if you compare polling averages to election outcomes, you really don't see a declining success. It's just that because of all of our elections are very, very close, people really want to know who's going to win. And so if you have kind of high profile failures there, even if you're only off by the average amount that you're always off, it creates a big story. For example, people were very mad about the polls in 2016. They were not very mad about the polls in 2020, but actually the polls in 2020 were worse, significantly worse. It's just that they still had Biden winning, whereas the polls in 2016 had Clinton winning. So even though they weren't off by much, they were off by enough to give people the wrong impression about who was going to win. And that's what people really care about. So in some sense, we're kind of asking more of polls than they can tell us. But there are real problems. Our ability to reach people on phones through any medium really is in decline. Response rates are low, and so anytime you're relying on 1% of the public to represent the rest of us, you're doing a lot of assumption-based modeling to try to get that to be a representative cast of how people feel. So, in some ways, it's surprising that polls are still as accurate today as they ever have been in terms of predicting the outcome.
And if I might, I think people are ever more interested in the internal polling. Maybe that's not the most sophisticated, but if Hispanic men are moving toward President Trump, or African American men, moving, or that it's such a small number that are actually being polled. Is there anything that institutionally the pollsters can use to address what are really very small populations being questioned, I would think?
Yeah, anytime you're trying to get an estimate for a smaller population and you have a smaller group of people who are surveyed, or a more unrepresentative group, you're going to have those kinds of same problems in polling amplified. And yes, it's true. Not only have we had multiple elections now in a row where Donald Trump was overall underestimated, but relative to the Democrats, but actually the racial pattern has also been similarly wrong now 3 elections in a row. 3 times the polls suggested that Republicans would be doing better among black voters than they ended up doing, but suggested they would do worse among Hispanic and white voters than they ended up doing. So it was sort of a continuation of challenges that we've been having in the survey industry. But I think one reason that all of this has come to the fore now more is that very few people are changing from one election to another. And so we're looking for where is the constituency where there really is a shift. It's not like, in 1964, Democrats won by 23 percentage points. Then 8 years later, they lost by 23 percentage points. So that's a lot of people, shifting from one side to another. And here we can pinpoint, it's a small group that's shifting in any one election, or that's sort of open to voting between the two candidates. So I think that's why we're sort of super fixated on what are the precise demographics that are making these moves.
Merrick, back to you.
I was going to say that's very interesting. Piggyback on polling for just 1 second. What advice would you give to people when they look at polls as to how to determine, I guess, how they should read the numbers in those polls? I followed polling pretty carefully in the 2024 election at the presidential level, and followed pollsters from both sides of the aisle who had dramatically different stories about each other and their accuracy of their polling, et cetera. But what would you say that an educated viewer of these polls should look for, when they read them?
Well, first, you have to tame your expectations. So, usually, for example, on polling something like presidential approval, the reported margin of error is only about half as much as the actual distribution of polling results. So that's another way of saying, you have to at least double the reported margin of error to get a good sense of, how far the repeated polling would likely be from the true answer or the outcome that we eventually see. Another thing I would take into consideration, and that also means, you should not take into consideration your favorite poll that moves the most in your direction, but you have to compare it to everything else that's been asked out there. Another important point I think I would make is I would pay attention to whether the polls are moving consistently with previous patterns, and if not, whether we have an explanation for that. So, for example, the the party out of the presidency is expected to do better in the midterm elections, usually by about 5 percentage points, even without any change in people's views of the president or anything, any major events. So if polls right now were moving against, or another way of seeing that is President Trump's approval rating should be going down from a high point of the start of the administration. So if you see polls showing slow declines in Republican Party support and Donald Trump's approval, that's consistent with what's happened, to all of the previous presidents that we've had polling about. So there would be a reason to expect, that you would see that kind of a pattern. We also have what we call thermostatic reactions to policy change. So that is when policy is moving in one direction, public opinion is usually moving in the other direction. Under the first Trump administration, immigration opinion was actually moving to be more supportive of immigration as the crackdown was occurring. Then under Biden, as we loosened immigration policy dramatically, public opinion was moving in a more conservative anti-immigration direction. And what you would expect now is that it would be moving more back in a more supportive direction as you get sort of the most extreme examples of the crackdown policy. Similarly with trade, we would expect the same kinds of dynamics. So I think I would say, what social scientists do is they see polls as, examples of a research hypothesis in action and evidence that's supportive or not supportive of that. But that also means that, you do have to pay attention to what does this new result say in the context of all of the previous results that we've had that are similar.
Well, that's very helpful. I'd like to turn now, you've done some fascinating work on when parties take over, like state legislatures, there's a shift to the Republicans, but yet there may be a lag between that political shift, at least in a nominal level, and their ability to affect major public policy changes. And I'm looking at Trump right now, and he certainly created a lot of interest in his public policies, but they're mainly through executive order, and as opposed to legislative enactments. What do you see as the prospects, given the current makeup of Congress, for President Trump to get some of his major programs through legislative enactments?
Well, the typical pattern, if you look at the major proposals that each new majority in Congress or new presidency make, is that only 1 or 2 items per Congress tend to make it through basically as advertised at the beginning on a party basis without much major compromise. The rest of the initiatives either don't happen at all, that's about half of them, or they happen in a quite modified form, usually by dispensing with all of the most controversial components of the policy proposal in order to generate much wider support between the political parties. So I think both parties want there to be this option where they get in charge, they've been empowered, and therefore they want to enact their full agenda on their own. And that's just never been the norm. It obviously varies from one Congress to the next, but there's never a point at which that's the normal process. The normal process is significant compromise if the proposal is controversial at all, and having to kind of fall back on what are the 1 or 2 priorities that they can get through on their own. Executive orders also, interestingly, follow some patterns that may be shifting with the latest administration. But for example, there is a professor at the University of Michigan who just looked at all the executive orders from the first Trump administration and found that although he made a lot more executive orders the first time, many of them actually ended up being symbolic, not really changing much policy. So the question is if that's true this time. Certainly the initial executive order flurry is bigger than we've ever had before. We're not to the first 100 days, and he's already above all of the prior 15 presidents, I think, that I had data for in the initial flurry of executive orders. And many of them have been substantive. So it could be that this one will be different than the others. But we do have to keep in mind that even those executive orders face some constraints. Some of them get overturned or dramatically limited by the courts. Some of them get overturned or dramatically limited by the next congressional majority. And some of them, never really had the tools to be implemented to achieve the goals. So you have to temper your expectations in policy as well.
Well, thank you, Bill. I'll turn things over to you for the last question.
Well, I guess like two general questions. One, what do you see in the context of both political parties for the 2026 election? You've mentioned there is a historic trend that whoever is in power tends to lose that. And then just any other comments generally about the political environment that we're going to be living in the, between now and the 2026 election?
Well, generally, we have a lot of self-reinforcing patterns here. So not much expectation that the party coalition trends that we've been discussing will reverse anytime soon, that either party will kind of go back to its old self easily. Yeah, not much a chance that one party will generate kind of a permanent majority. That is, we have some tendencies that mean that the other party gets a chance to make a comeback in the midterm elections, and that should be true this time as well. One of the reasons for that is that the party in power tends to overshoot voter preferences. They tend to go further than voters want in their ideological direction. And there's no sign that that's going to change under the Trump administration, just as it didn't change under the previous few administrations. But I think it is an interesting political time because we have this mix of extreme polarization between the parties, big close divides, and a parity between the two sides. And yet people's expectation that, that they're going to win, get their way, and be able to enact their agenda. And I think the disconnect between those makes people, feel a little less efficacious about politics. But I think looking at the historical patterns makes it clear that that should be the expectation, that in order for big changes to pass Congress or even state legislatures tends to require some compromise between the two big sides.
Well, thank you, Merrick. To
Yeah, I
you.
was just going to ask you to comment on one final thing. You mentioned something about the calcification of voting behavior. And you also mentioned the polarization. And I guess I could infer that we've calcified some of the polarization. And would you say that we're in store for the next foreseeable future with this intense division in politics that we've sort of gotten used to over the past 3 election cycles?
Certainly, we're likely to see continuation of intense division, and no sign that the Trump administration will reverse that trend, or that the reaction to it will be dramatically different. I will clarify that it's not necessarily that we are on completely opposite sides of every policy issue and we're moving further apart, as some people normally think. It's just more like that we have lined up our partisanship with our ideological views, with our policy opinions generally. And a lot of that is actually a product of information. People want to believe polarization is about misinformation, but a lot of it is that the parties have clear different agendas and that their cultural views are now aligned with their economic views. And so if you want to choose your party on the basis of cultural characteristics or on the basis of economic issue attitudes, you have clear choices, and most people are now aligned with the side that they agree with, which wasn't always true. Plenty of people maintained partisanship for long periods that was inconsistent with most of their political views. Many people, today's least informed voters can tell you as many differences between the two political parties accurately as the most informed voters could in the 1970s. And that's because those differences are clear and people have learned those differences. So part of what we're going through is people reacting to two stark political choices.
Well, Professor, I want to thank you for a fascinating interview. We hope we can invite you back again as we get closer to the 2026 midterms for your views on where we stand at that point in time. Thank you for joining us today.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you.